Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Re-Federalist Report. I am Brady, also known as the War Hamster in some corners of the internet, and joining me today is my good friend, constitutional mentor, Douglas V. Gibbs.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming. Today we are continuing our series on reviewing James Madison's notes from the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. We're doing this because we want to really get inside the head of the founding fathers and understand what original intent really means. And from their arguments, what's proposed, what's debated, and what's actually ratified tells you an awful lot about what their fears were and what their hopes were. And this has been a great exercise so far. It's going to be a long series, but I think it's worth doing it in detail. First episode, we talked, we're going doing this in chronological order as Madison's notes go.
Right.
The first several weeks, they spent debating how they were going to actually run the convention. You're going to want to go back and watch episodes 1 and 2 before watching this, probably. But I'll just give you a quick overview of what we talked about in the first 2 if you don't have time to do that. They meet in Philadelphia. They realized the Articles of Confederation were not working. They were going to lead to anarchy and a dissolution of the Union. They needed a stronger Union. To do that, they were going to have to form an executive branch and a federal judiciary. That's the big takeaway, the reasons they were meeting. Again, they were meeting in secrecy because had everyone known that they were going to change the Articles of Confederation altogether, there probably would have been riots. That's why Madison's notes are the only real official notes that were allowed to be taken. So week 1, they talked about how they're going to run the convention. There's a lot of debating. Episode 2, we started with, why do I always keep forgetting this gentleman's name? Mr. Randolph from Virginia gave his list of proposals. And
who is, by the way, Jefferson's cousin. Really.
Very good. And what were the deficiencies of the Articles of Confederation? What do we need to improve? And what should this new document or what should these amendments be like? One of the other major points we made is 12 of the 13 states were represented. Rhode Island was not. The smugglers of Rhode Island didn't want any kind of government whatsoever, and it took all 13 to amend the Articles of Confederation. So Rhode Island says we're not going to do it. This is a problem they'd get past it somehow.
Hmm.
So,
well, when you're left out hanging by yourself, and the other 12 states have ratified something, kind of encouraging to join the Union rather than be plucked at by European nations.
Yeah, especially when you're a small state of a lot of inland waterways, basically run by smugglers.
Yeah, well, it was an important central hub for certain things like slavery.
Yes, it was. Okay, so with no further ado, after Mr. Randolph had presented the Virginia plan, the next person to speak was a very interesting guy by the name of Mr. Charles Pinckney. And I'm going to share the screen real briefly.
Yeah. And off screen, I had mentioned, young guy, maybe the youngest. And so not that I'm trying to steal some of your thunder. I'm sure you can talk about it. But Warhamster says, well, not necessarily. He thought he was, or he said he was. I'm like, what? So
yeah, Pinckney, and we'll get into that in a second. But yeah, Pinckney claimed to be the youngest guy there. He was not. He claimed to be the youngest, but he was not the youngest. He was actually 29, not 24, as he claimed. But we'll get into that. So we are reading from the Avalon Project, which is a Yale University website that is absolutely fantastic for historical documents.
Yale does something right.
Every once in a while. All right, so Mr. Pinckney then lays out before the House the draft of a federal government which he had prepared to be agreed upon between the free and independent states of America. Mr. P. for Pinckney plan ordered that the same be referred to the Committee of the Whole appointed to consider the state of the American Union. What's interesting is in Madison's notes, Pinckney is spelled Pinkney. That is not how he spelled his name, which I thought was interesting. It's actually Pinck. So we're going to get into this draft of federal government.
His age wasn't right. The spelling of his name was right. What else is going on with Mr. Pinckney? One wonders.
Well, let's talk about it. Let's get into these founding fathers. I want to do this as we go instead of just relying on Madison's notes. Let's look at their backstory. And so I'm going to pull up the Wikipedia notes on Charles Pinckney, and Doug will be able to fill in some pretty interesting anecdotes as well. So you should have my Wikipedia up now. Yep, there it is. And is that big enough to read, or do I want to blow it up? Let's blow it up a little bit. And here's a very horrible picture of him. Looks like a typical Southern gentleman. So Charles Pinckney Jr.
A young man with an attitude too, but that's beside the point.
Very much so, but he's a capable guy. Born in 1757. So by my math, if his convention is in 1787, how old is he? 30 or 29 going on 30.
Mm-hmm.
And died in 1824. Was an American founding father, planter, and politician who was a signer of the U.S. Constitution. He was elected and served as the 37th governor of South Carolina, later serving 2 more non-consecutive terms. He also served as a U.S. Senator and member of the House of Representatives. He was a first cousin once removed of fellow signer Charles Coachworth Pinckney. And Charles Coachworth Pinckney was also from South Carolina, one of the delegates here. Pinckney's descendants included 7 future South Carolina governors, including men related to the Maybank and the Rhett families. So you want to talk, I always talk about the New England aristocracy, but South Carolina's got every bit the same. In fact, Charleston is about it. You know, you want to talk about a class system in society. Charleston, South Carolina is it. These are very old American families, and your bloodlines matter in South Carolina. I actually lived there when I was 4 and 5 years old when my dad was stationed in Charleston. Don't remember too well. Okay. So Pinckney was born and educated in Charlestown in the province of South Carolina. His father, Colonel Charles Pinckney, was a wealthy lawyer and planter. His mother was Frances Bruton, daughter of Goldsmith and sister of Miles Bruton and Rebecca Bruton Mott, who were both also prominent in Charleston history. Now, we could go on these names and really look at the bloodlines, but just take for what we said. This is old American money. His father had signed a loyalty oath to the British after they occupied Charleston in 1780 during the American Revolutionary War. This oath enabled him to keep his property. On his death in 1782, the senior Pinckney bequeathed Snee Farm, a plantation outside the city, and the enslavement of numerous people to his eldest son, Charles. So he's a slave owner, Doug. Should we cancel him?
He's in South Carolina. And South Carolina and Georgia were the most steadfast slave states of the original 13.
Mm-hmm. Very much so. And I think we've talked about this, but the original Declaration of Independence, Jefferson included words. It was like 154 words.
It was 168 words of anti-slavery language. And according to his biography, he removed it because of South Carolina and Georgia indicating that they would refuse to sign the Declaration if that language remained.
And it was very important for the Declaration of Independence to be signed by all 13.
Right. And the key point there when I talk to people who don't necessarily agree with me is think about this. These racist early United States, 11 out of 13 liked that language. Just saying.
Well, everybody was racist back then. They just didn't want to get rid of their slaves. It was a business model. I mean, the people, you know, I don't want to relitigate this again on this show, but you know, Lincoln was a racist, like you wouldn't believe.
Oh yeah,
yeah.
Big
I mean,
time.
That was just the attitude.
Well, you know, and you got to look at the historically, and a lot of it is not being educated about certain things, including other people. But you got to remember the African resident, the black people, when they first started going into Africa, word into Europe was that there was a wild, hairy, or wild man that must be related to the wild hairy man, which was the gorilla, that was also there, but it didn't have as much hair. They literally thought they were just two creatures of the same, species, and that was just ignorance, just because they didn't know. Not racism per se yet. Then once they began to realize, they had language, they had the ability to think, and so on and so forth. And then, unfortunately, some of these ideas came in. The thing is, slavery was already alive and well in Africa long before the Europeans even ventured into the continent.
Oh, there's slavery in the Bible. I mean, it's thousands of years old. It was nothing new. Americans certainly didn't invent it.
Well, the word slave comes from Slav, Slavic, as in white people were enslaving white people at that point. But anyway.
But it's actually a lot of the Muslims were enslaving the Slavs. They'd go up and raid up into Europe. All right, continuing. Busy with the war in his political career, Pinckney did not marry until 1788. He married Mary Eleanor Lawrence on April 27, 1788, at St. Philip's Church in Charleston. Marries the daughter, skip up. They had 3 children. Among his in-laws were father-in-law Henry Lawrence, Colonel John Lawrence, and U.S. Representative David Ramsey. A brother-in-law married the daughter of South Carolina Governor John Rutledge.
John Rutledge, that's a name that South Carolinians know. Very famous in history.
Yeah, he's also there in Philadelphia at the convention. Mm-hmm. So we've already mentioned 3 of South Carolina's 4 delegates. The 4th, of course, being Pierce Butler. All right, so let's go through Pinckney's career pretty quickly. He's elected a delegate to the Third Continental Congress in 1777 and 78. Pinckney started to practice law in Charleston in 1779 at the age of 21. So he's at the Continental Congress at the age of 19. Pretty impressive.
Mm-hmm.
About that time, well after the War of Independence had begun, Pinckney enlisted in the militia and became a lieutenant and served in the siege of Savannah. That's Georgia. When Charleston fell to the British the following year, Pinckney was captured. He was held as a prisoner until June 1781 and sent north for a potential exchange. He did not return to Charleston until 1783. The British also captured Pinckney's father. Pinckney and more than 160 men signed oaths of allegiance to the British to avoid having property confiscated. After the war, Pinckney was fined 12% of his property for having sworn the oath of allegiance. That's interesting. I guess in that position, most people might have done the same.
Sure. Especially when you think your side is in trouble anyway.
Yeah, the war wasn't going well early on. I mean, South Carolina fell.
It wasn't going well most of the way.
Yeah. It was, they were losing until they won.
Yeah, basically.
Pinckney was elected again to the Continental Congress the following year, served from 1784 to 1787, which is where it brings us to Philadelphia. He was also elected to the state legislature for several terms. As a nationalist, it's interesting. As a nationalist, he worked in the Congress to ensure that the United States would receive navigation rights from Spain to the Mississippi River and to strengthen congressional power. So he starts out as
you got to remember that John Taylor Caroline writes this in his book, A New View of the Constitution of the United States, which was published in 1823, that going into the convention, pretty much all of them had a nationalist attitude in which this central government was going to be stronger than what they wound up creating. And that while the small states really railed against the Virginia plan, everybody else pretty much liked it. They liked this idea of the larger states having a more say and the federal government having a very powerful voice, and even the federal Congress being able to negative state law if they felt it was outside the principles of the Constitution. Of course, during the convention, cooler heads prevailed. The Jeffersonian ideas bled in, even though Jefferson wasn't there. And a lot of these quote unquote nationalists weren't so nationalist by the end of the convention. It's a very fascinating metamorphosis to watch.
Yeah, and what Doug just said, you're going to see it reflect. Keep it in mind when we get into the document that Pinckney submits, because his nationalist tendencies are going to be glaring. And what he proposes, In contrast to what was actually in the Constitution, what Doug just said is almost verbatim what happened. You can see it happening in real time as we go through Madison's notes. So that's a great point you made. Thank you. Pinckney eventually owned several plantations and a townhouse in Charleston, in addition to the Snee Farm. Frankville and Hopton, situated on both sides of the Congaree River, near Columbia, plantation in Georgetown, consisting of 560 acres of tidal swamp and 600 acres of highland, a tract of 1,200 acres across Lynch's Creek, Bee Farm on the Ashapo River, Shell House, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to skip over some of this. After Pinckney married Eleanor Lawrence in 1788, the elegant three-story brick home on 16 Meeting Street in Charleston presumably became his principal residence. In the 1790 federal census, he is recorded as enslaving 14 slaves in St. Philip's and St. Michael's Parish, 52 slaves in St. Bartholomew, and 45 slaves in Orangeburg District, all in addition to Snee Farm, where his father's probate record had listed 40 enslaved people. So he's got about 200 slaves. That's a lot. Pinckney's role in the Constitutional Convention is controversial. Although one of the younger delegates, he later claimed to have been the most influential one and contended he had submitted a draft known as the Pinckney Plan that was the basis of the final Constitution. We're going to read the Pinckney Plan here shortly. This narrative was strongly disputed by James Madison and some of the other framers. Pinckney submitted an elaborate form of the Virginia Plan first proposed by Edmund Randolph, which we read last week.
And which was actually written by Madison.
Other delegates disregarded it. Historians assess him as being an important contributing delegate. Pinckney boasted that he was 24, allowing him to claim the distinction as the youngest delegate, but he was 29 years old at the time of the convention. He attended full-time, spoke often and effectively, contributed to the final draft, and resolved problems that arose during the debates. He also worked to ratify the Constitution of South Carolina in 1788. That's one of the state constitutions we're going to want to review when we get to that.
Yeah, Pinckney very verbose, and there's a film called A More Perfect Union that is put out by NCCS.net, the National Center for Constitutional Studies. And the character who plays Pinckney, they play him well. He's very verbose in that film. But anyway, I just wanted to point that out, that he was the typical youngster who thought he understood everything and didn't understand quite as much as he thought he did. It's funny because in today's society, we feel the same way about youngsters, and when we were younger, same thing. So it is funny watching him.
And to his credit, he's a very sharp guy. He's a big contributor.
Yeah, a little what's the word? A little arrogant, but
yeah, well, you
got to be arrogant sometimes to operate in these types of settings, though.
Indeed. At the convention, Pierce Butler and Pinckney, both from South Carolina, introduced the Fugitive Slave Clause, which became Article 4, Section 2, Clause 3. James Wilson of Pennsylvania objected, saying it was a special protection for enslavers, requiring all state governments to enforce it at taxpayers' expense in places where no one or most residents did not enslave people. Butler withdrew the clause, but the next day, a Southerner reinstated it, and the convention adopted it without further objection. This clause was added to the clause that provided extradition for fugitives from justice.
One wonders, based on what you just read, did it wind up passing because it wasn't Pinckney behind it anymore? Does that kind of give you a clue as maybe what they thought about his interjections?
That's kind of how we got the Federal Reserve Act. It was originally submitted by Senator Aldrich as the Aldrich Plan, and people knew that Aldrich was a puppet of the bankers, and the populace rejected it. When it was tweaked just a little bit and resubmitted from the House a year later, it passed. So that's very, very good observation, Doug. And this is basically from the Constitution. No person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service of labor may be due. the Fugitive Slave Clause in the future Fugitive Slave Act is one of the contributions to the dispute that led to the quote unquote Civil War. So this is important stuff.
Yeah.
That objection by James Wilson is something the Northerners would echo for decades.
And James Wilson, you have to understand, James Wilson was not only a very sharp guy, and he's interesting because he kind of leaned nationalist way, but at the same time, he was probably one of the better debaters of the convention, and he recognized some of the key functions of the federal government, key principles of the Constitution. And he was probably the loudest voice and the most convincing voice during the Pennsylvania ratifying convention. But my favorite is James Wilson. I have a quote by him way back then about the importance of protecting life even while it's still stirring in the womb. I love using that quote for a certain issue that I like to talk about. I'm sure you can figure it out. Go ahead.
I think I can get that one. Yeah, Wilson really was a nationalist. He might have been about as Hamiltonian as Hamilton.
Almost.
His famous state.
He also liked to play golf, by the way, too. But anyway, go ahead.
I didn't know that part.
Yeah.
His famous State House speech, which is one of the more important speeches that got the Constitution ratified, really wasn't what he's saying most of the time. It was probably about the most, shall we say, liberal he ever was. And I use that liberal in a good term, not the way it's used today. Okay, this clause was first applied to fugitive slaves and required they be extradited back to upon enslavers' claims, despite the clause states sometimes declined to enforce it. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 increased requirements on estates and penalties for failure to assist in re-enslavement. Again, this leads to
and the language there is, of course, of the day, re-enslavement. That is to assume that they stopped being a slave at one point. And from the law's point of view, no, they just because they were in free territory didn't mean they lost enslavement and then got re-enslaved. But anyway.
And this debates also why Jefferson went away from Locke's original life, liberty, and property and went to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Slaves were considered property, and this nation was founded on property rights. So
right.
That's where the debate really comes down to. The founding fathers really cared about property rights because they just been dealing with a tyrannical British government that could seize their property. So this was a big deal. To be free, you had to be able to own property.
Yeah, and you got to remember, from a European point of view, owning property really wasn't possible. It's the king's realm. Everything belongs to the government. You can lease it, you can work it, and things like that. And so that was one of the appeals of the New World, was you could own property.
Yeah,
that was one of the appeals that brought people here.
They were giving it away.
Yeah.
You get here, you get 10 acres or something?
Yeah, you're rich. You get to start a whole new life a little bit. And so property rights is a huge, from the very, very beginning.
Excellent. All right, this practice was not eliminated until the 13th Amendment, the third 13th Amendment, by the way, abolished the institution of slavery in 1864 during the Civil War, in an effort to repeal this clause of the Constitution had failed. I say it's the third 13th Amendment. We've talked about the missing 13th Amendment, but in 1861, they proposed a 13th Amendment that would have allowed slavery to continue where it already existed, and Lincoln was in favor of that. So think about that when they talk about Lincoln being anti-slavery.
Yeah.
Pinckney introduced a clause in the Constitution opposing an established state religion. That's a big deal. His no religious test clause read as follows: no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States.
Any office under the trust of the United States.
Yeah, he's a big reason we got freedom of religion. And this mattered because some of the colonies were founded as purely Catholic or purely Protestant. Rhode Island was formed because they wanted to get away from the Puritans of Massachusetts. So this is a really important. This was on the minds of the founders.
Yeah, not that I'm going to tell the story, but that idea became very important when it came to the Danbury Baptists. When they wrote Jefferson, when he became president, they were being treated as second-class citizens. An established church controlled who could be in office. You had to be a member of the church in good standing. You had to be a member of the church in order to vote, in order to operate in other civic duties, and the established church even received tax money from the state. And Jefferson was actually one of the big proponents for religious freedom. In fact, he's the one that wrote the Religious Freedom Act of 1786 for Virginia, which was based on the Remonstrances writings by Madison, or influenced, I should say, not based, but heavily influenced by Madison's writings. But anyway, go ahead.
Forgive me, I had to go off camera for a second to sneeze. My allergies are kicking in. All right. Once the phrase was included in a vote, it passed with little opposition. For the first time, an official of a national government was not required to have a religion. So this is a big deal. Pinckney's a historically significant figure. That's why we're talking about him.
Understand, though, when it comes to that clause in the Constitution, the religious test clause applies to those who are holding office. It doesn't apply to other things. I know some people who oppose me on certain issues want to claim, for example, that, well, immigration law cannot, religious tests, you can't say a certain group can't. Actually, they can. The religious test clause only applies to those holding office.
Very good. Pinckney is also responsible for the inclusion of the writ of habeas corpus into the Constitution. Initially introduced as, nor shall the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus ever be suspended except in cases of rebellion or invasion, it is now part of Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution. It's pretty significant, huh?
Very much so.
All right. Later career, Pinckney's political career blossomed. From 1789 to 92, state legislature elected him as the governor of South Carolina. In 1790, he chaired the state constitutional convention, and in 1792, he received 8 votes from the legislature for the U.S. Senate. During this period, he became associated with the Federalist Party.
There you go. And not to be confused with federalism or federalists who believe in the Constitution. They're
the exact opposite.
Exactly.
Yeah, cue the Darth Vader music when I say that. He became associated with the Federalist Party. Boom, boom, boom. All right, where he and his cousin, Charles Coatsworth Pinckney, were leaders. But with the passage of time, the former's views, this is Charles, began to change. In 1795, he attacked the Federalist-backed Jay Treaty. That's for John Jay. He increasingly began casting his lot with Carolina backcountry Democratic Republicans against this Eastern elite.
Yeah, real quick note, everybody wants to call them the Democratic Republicans. They weren't called the Democratic Republicans until a short period during the 1830s, when there was a battle within the party between the Andrew Jackson Democrats and the John Quincy Adams Republicans. So understand that the term Democratic Republicans didn't emerge. I think part of the reason why it's become a part of our lexicon is because if you were to say what they're really being called, the Republicans, people get confused.
Yeah, and the Republican Party that would be formed in the 1850s was nothing like these Democratic Republicans. The Republican Party that was of Lincoln were nationalists. Right. They were very much like the Federalists.
Yeah, they're nothing like today's Republican Party. And well, today's Republican Party is nothing like what it was 10 years ago, but it's beside the point.
Well, they were rhinos 10 years ago. They may be going the right direction now. We'll see.
Yeah. The neocons are on the run.
We'll see. The population in the western part of the state was increasing, but legislative apportionment favored the low country planters. In 1796, Pinckney was elected governor again by the state legislature. In 1798, his Democrat-Republican supporters in the legislature elected him to the U.S. Senate. 1798 is really interesting that he's there because that's when the Federalists passed their Alien and Seditions Act, and he is now kind of going away from that.
Mm-hmm.
Pinckney strongly opposed the actions of his former party. In the presidential election of 1800, Pinckney served as Thomas Jefferson's campaign manager in South Carolina. So how Doug talks about a lot of people had a change of heart during the convention, Pinckney's came 10 years later. The victorious Jefferson appointed Pinckney as minister to Spain. Pinckney tried but failed to gain Spanish Florida cession to the United States. Pinckney facilitated Spanish acquiescence in the transfer of Louisiana from France to the United States in 1803 by the Louisiana Purchase. And it says Spain had already returned rule of this territory to France under Napoleon. All right, Pinckney returns from Spain to Charleston and the leadership of the state Democrat-Republican Party. Pinckney served in the legislature in 1805 and 06 and was elected again as governor in 1806 to 08. In this position, he favored legislative reapportionment to give more fair representation to backcountry districts. So pretty decent.
Limited government guy, small government guy, and also he wants the rural areas to have a voice, which was kind of the point to the Senate. Interesting.
Yeah. Pinckney also advocated universal white manhood suffrage. That means you didn't have to be a property owner. He served again in the legislature from 1810 to 14 and then temporarily withdrew from politics. In 1818, he won a U.S. House of Representatives election where he fought against the Missouri Compromise,
which I believe extended slavery, the life of slavery.
That's entirely possibly true. He was a major enslaver whose wealth depended on enslaved labor at his plantations. Pinckney supported an expansion of the institution of slavery to new territories and states. And as we've talked about ad nauseum, that was the battle going on in the 1850s, where we had the bloody Kansas and all others. But we've litigated that already. We're not going to do that on this show. But this guy Pinckney is one of them. And that's pretty much it for him. He's got a bunch of legacy and honors. 1821, with his health beginning to fail, Pinckney retired. Dies in 1824, and there's all kinds of memorials for him. So, pretty interesting guy.
Yeah, as he got older, he got a little wiser.
Funny how that works.
Yeah. Doesn't always happen, but then again, some guys don't get a chance to get that old like Hamilton because of, I don't know, certain shots to the leg, but that's beside the point.
I still have hope for Bernie Sanders. All right, so let's look at this document that Pinckney submits very early on at the Constitutional Convention. I think it's really enlightening.
His version of the Virginia Plan, basically.
Yeah, and the differences are interesting. So we're going to go over here to the draft of the federal government, which he had prepared. Outline of the plan, and he uses a lot of abbreviations. I'll try to interpret them as best as possible. Give me your ideas on that. He says, the outline of the plan, a confederation between the free and independent states of N. H. I don't know what he's using that abbreviation for, but he uses it a lot. Is hereby solemnly made, uniting them together under one general superintending governor for their common benefit and for their defense and security against all designs and leagues that may be injurious to their interests and against all force and attacks offered to or made upon them or any of them. He starts out, the first two words, the second word, confederation. They consider themselves a confederation and not a nation. Doug, really, once again, hammer home the difference between the two.
Well, a confederation is a loose membership of member states in which the member states retain most or all of their powers, and the central government, if there is one, is just there for the purpose of the union, but it really has no power. In a nation or national system, it's the exact opposite. All of the power is given to the centralized government, and that umbrella of power over even can overrule and supersede any local or state decisions typically. So the founders are looking at these two extremes. They're going, okay, we don't want that. We don't want that. Where do we find the balance? Where do we find something in between?
Yeah, and most certainly we're not creating a nation. And
right.
We've become that, since Lincoln, and that's really the problem. So we talk about nationalists. These are the people that wanted a very strong central government, and most of the colonials absolutely feared a strong central government. They just fought a bloody Revolutionary War to get away from the most powerful central government in world history.
Right.
This is what they're trying to get away from. The last thing they want to do is be serving under a new, authoritarian government.
Exactly.
And it makes that very clear by using the word confederation. Number two, the style, spelled interestingly. I like this third bullet point. Mutual intercourse. Talking about free trade among the states, no tariffs internally. This was a problem under the Articles of Confederation, and this is one of the things they were there.
You got to remember, the states were very, very protectionist. They did everything they could to protect their manufacturing and anything. Excuse me. They're like their own countries.
Yes,
they fought like cats and dogs.
But if we're going to have a union, it should be free trade among the different sovereign states. Community of privileges, pretty much the same thing. Surrender of criminals. Laws in one state need to apply to others, and this also sort of touches on the Fugitive Slave Act.
Right.
And faith to proceedings. I'm not sure exactly what he means to saying there. Number 4, he proposes 2 branches of the legislature, Senate and the House of Delegates. Together, the U.S. Congress is assembled. That mimics the Virginia plan. HD, which is the House of Delegates, to consist of 1 member for every 1,000 inhabitants, 3/5 of blacks included. Not mistaken, I think that's the first time we see the 3/5 black law applied was here in this document. It's interesting, the House delegates to be 1 member for every 1,000 inhabitants. If that were the case today, I believe that means we'd have, 300,000?
Yeah.
Bad
idea.
Population was a lot smaller back then. Let's see if Virginia was the most populous state at the time with about 800,000 people. So they would have had 800 delegates. It's a bit much. Not sure they had buildings back then big enough to hold them all. The Senate to be elected from 4 districts to serve by rotation of 4 years, to be elected by the House of Delegates either from among themselves or the people at large. So he's suggesting the Senate is not elected by the state legislature, but by Congress. And they have a 4-year term. Eventually that would become 6. So some of his proposals don't make it out of committee. The Senate and House delegates shall by joint ballot annually choose the President of the United States from amongst themselves or the people at large. That's interesting because that didn't happen. It'll be debated further on at this convention, but this is one of the proposals. Can you imagine, would Donald Trump ever be president if the House of Representatives chose him?
Yeah.
Or if Congress did? No, it wasn't going to happen in a million years. In the president, in the executive authority of the U.S. shall be vested. Okay, well, that's still the case. His powers and duties, he shall have a right to advise with the heads of the different departments as his counsel. So that suggests a weaker executive than we currently have.
Mm-hmm.
The right to advise. A council of revision consisting of the presidents for the affairs, secretary of war, heads of the departments of treasury and admiralty, or any 2 of them together with the president. Now, keep that in mind, this council of revision, because he doesn't really suggest what those powers are until later in the document. But that's something we're going to want to talk about. The members of the Senate and the House of Delegates shall each have 1 vote and shall be paid out of the common treasury. The time and election of the members of the House of Delegates and the meeting of the U.S. Senate in Congress assembled. That's something that needs to be discussed. No state to make treaties, lay interfering duties, again, free trade, keep a naval...
Not only that, but also for the states not to interfere with it at all.
Yeah, that's the reason we're creating this federal government, is to handle these international affairs, period. You can't have 13 different treaties. Keep a naval or land force militia accepted to be disciplined, etc., according to the regulations of the United States. So we're saying is they're going to tell you how much of a militia you can keep. And that goes directly against state sovereignty. Each state retains its rights not expressly delegated, 10th Amendment, but no bill of the legislature of any state shall become a law till it shall have been laid before the Senate and the House of Delegates assembled and received their approbation. He's saying, basically, this is a nationalist bullet point.
Mhm.
He says, your states can do what you want, but if you pass a law, like your speed limit's going to be 55 miles an hour, you got to go to Congress first. Obviously, that's not going to fly with most of the people in Philadelphia, and it didn't. But it gives you an idea of his nationalist inclinations back in 1787. He actually wanted Congress to be able to supersede state law. You talk about a federal negative of state law, this is it right here. And it did not pass. Any thoughts on that?
No, go ahead.
Right.
And I've also been looking up to see if NH, and every time I go to look it up, they keep suggesting that it stands for New Hampshire, but in the context it's used, I believe it's national something. But anyway.
No, well, let me know if you get it, because I'm curious. I don't know what it means. Go skip to 12. The Senate and House of Delegates in Congress assembled shall have exclusive power of regulating trade and levying imposts. Each state may lay embargoes in times of scarcity. Again, the federal government is basically handling international affairs, of which trade is one of them. But he wants to make an exception in terms of emergency. The problem with that's an Emergency Powers Act. And who declares when there's an emergency? Who declares when there's a time of scarcity? He wants to establish post offices.
Communication throughout the Union.
Senate and House delegates shall be last resort on appeal in disputes between two or more states, which authority shall be exercised in the following manner, etc.
Again, we have the national legislature having the final say, being the final arbiters over state decisions. And as you and I have talked about on the show prior, if that had been the case, if this is the kind of stuff that was in there, the states would have never ratified it.
Absolutely. But that's his nationalist tendencies. He wants to centralize the decision making.
Right.
Says the Senate and the House of Delegates shall institute offices and appoint officers for the departments of 4. Affairs, War, Treasury, and Admiralty.
The seas.
Yep. They shall have the exclusive power of declaring what shall be treason and I don't know what he's saying there, of treason against the United States, and of instituting a federal judicial court to which an appeal shall be allowed from the judicial courts of the several states in all causes wherein questions shall arise on the construction of treaties made by, let's stop right there.
Yeah, the MISP of treason, just based on the context, I don't know for sure. I believe that would be the punishment of treason.
Okay.
Which the penalty for treason and the definition of treason is actually laid out in the Constitution, but the punishment for treason in the Constitution in Article 3 is given to Congress. So right now it's death, but Congress can always change that.
Okay. The part I find interesting, we always gets back to this, and of instituting a federal judicial court. So creating a federal court, which didn't exist before, to which an appeal shall be allowed from the judicial courts of the several states in all causes. What's he saying?
Which is what is believed today to be the case, but was not originally intended.
Yes, there was no, when they left Philadelphia, there was no federal judicial negative of state courts. They were considered, a state Supreme Court was co-equal with a federal Supreme Court. Not one could not.
Right. It was dependent on what the issue was. If it's a state authority, stays in state courts. If the federal authority, goes to federal courts. That was the attitude. And
that's exactly what he's saying. He's actually talking about who has jurisdiction. And that's really the key point. So he says that the several states in all causes wherein questions shall arise, and he lists out what the federal judiciaries can actually talk about. And this is actually similar to what you see in Article 3. And it does not mention intrastate issues. It says construction of treaties made by U.S. or on the laws of nations, or on the regulations of U.S. concerning trade and revenue, or wherein U.S. shall be a party. The court shall consist of judges to be appointed during good behavior. There's that again. Senate and House of Delegates shall have exclusive right of instituting in each state a court of admiralty and appointing the judges, etc., of the same for all maritime causes which may arise therein, respectively.
And notice here, there's a separation between the courts. However, if you go back to the beginning, an appeal is allowed from the states to the federal government from his point of view, federal courts. And that's the part that was not in the Constitution.
Yeah, but I think it's what he does.
The rest of it is pretty much in line with what wound up in Article 3.
Yeah, and if you go read Article 3, if you have to, again, or read this, it does not say that this federal court has jurisdiction over what happens in your state, unless it has to do with the United States government itself, or has to do with international trade or admiralty.
Yeah, well, basically, it doesn't fall under federal authority, or is the federal government a party, or is the state a party? That is one of the caveats. Is while it needs to be under jurisdiction, the jurisdiction needs to be based partly on authority. If a state is party, regardless of what it is, then it just jumps to the Supreme Court and it becomes a federal issue. But anyway, go ahead.
No, it's one of the most important points we've been hammering home of where the Constitution, how did we get so far away from the original intent of the Constitution? And it started 2 years after this was after this meeting, when they passed the Judiciary Act of 1789 and completely went against what Article 3's intent was.
Yeah, well, we've had historians and politicians and judges tell us what it says and what it means, and it's not even close. People are shocked, for example, when we talk about the National Guard, for example, in Los Angeles, and I said, well, it says right there, Article 1, Section 8, the militia can be called up to execute the laws of the Union. That's what he's trying to do, execute federal law, immigration, and the militia can be called up to do that, to execute the law. And that's what it is. Where's the confusion?
And immigration is clearly a federal power.
Oh, yeah.
Federal threat. I mean, that's not even
even people that disagree with us politically agree that it's a federal authority,
and it has to be. Which is why the sanctuary states have absolutely no constitutional. Real quick, you gave me a chance to plug something real quick because of this, what you just said. So I just wrote an article on the early morning hours of June 20th, 2025. Titled Sanctuary Illusion. If you go to politicalpistachio.com or you go to douglasvgibbs.com and then hit blog on the link bar, either way you'll get there and look for that article. I'll answer your questions. Very good. All right, moving on to 16. Senate and House of Delegates assembled shall have the. It's important to always say assembled because you have to actually be in Congress.
Well, you got to remember too, the Continental Congress, because you heard this here, First Continental Congress, Second Continental Congress, Third Continental. That's when they were assembled. When they weren't assembled, there was no Congress. See, today our Congress critters are just always there, but even when they're not assembled, it's still there. But back then, if you were not assembled, Congress was not in session. It didn't, in a sense, exist. That's the reason why it's the third Congress. The second Congress stopped existing when they were no longer assembled. So we have to keep that in mind. Yeah,
and that's why the president is given all kinds of recess powers. Because
exactly.
you have to be able to execute the government when everyone's back on their farms.
Right.
So 16, they're talking about the right of coining money, regulating its alloy and value, fixing the standard of weights and measures throughout the United States.
And that's important. That's the Congress coining money. Coining meaning creating money. Although I think the word coin is important for other reasons too. Because once again, I'm not trying to get too into the Constitution too much here, but this is an important point. If Congress or the House of Delegates and Senate, in this case, is coining the money, who isn't? The banks. This was the Founding Fathers' way of getting away from the influence of the banking systems, coin their own money, control their own money, not allow those external entities to dictate our monetary system. It was, and even this guy, nationalist or not, his attitude was, stay out of our business. This is an American thing. We're going to take care of our own money. Thank you very much. I'm sure Hamilton was biting his lip about this point, but that's beside the point. Go ahead.
All right. Points in which the assent of more than a bare majority shall be necessary. Talking about what's it take to ratify everything like that, or pass bills. He wanted that to be debated. Impeachments shall be before the House of Delegates, before the Senate, and the judges of the Federal Judicial Court. We've never properly used the power of impeachment.
Yeah, understand here, even in this document, in the Virginia plan, all of the early documents, the two houses were different from each other. House of Delegates, House of Representatives, whatever you want to call it, would be democratically voted in by the people. The Senate would be the voice of the states. The states would be appointing those members. And they believe that the impeachments from day one should be by the representatives of the people, but that the Senate would be the judges of it.
Very good. Senate and House of Delegates shall regulate the militia throughout the U.S. You want Congress running the military?
Yeah, well, and here's the thing. He's saying shall. Now, what was meant by regulating is the rules. Now, that said, the very idea in Article 1, Section 8 that allows Congress to call up the militia for service to the United States, and that the commander-in-chief, when they are in service to the United States, is their commander-in-chief, the president, that set off a lot of people. They wanted no federal authority whatsoever over the militias. They feared it'd be used as a standing army against the people. But you got to remember also things were still a little hot. They just come out of a war.
Yeah, and we just also had Shays' Rebellion, and that's why this is such a big deal.
Yeah.
But what you're actually saying is that when Lincoln called up the militia, he didn't have the right to do it. Congress had to.
Yeah, Congress calls them up. The president deploys.
All right. The means of enforcing and compelling the payment of the quota of each state. Taxes.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they're going to obviously have debate over, is this based on population? And that's where you get that 3/5 clause matters.
And the compelling, the states basically held on to the idea, well, no, we're going to decide whether or not we send it.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Too bad we don't have that anymore.
Yeah, well, what was going on during the 1800s, basically, before any payment based on their population was sent to the federal government to help fund the government from the states basically would take a look at the budget, and then they would decide whether or not they'd send the money. Say, we're not sending money to spend it on this. You get rid of that out of the budget, then you'll get your money. And what that did is that kept the federal government pretty constitutional. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that money was the make or break, because for many years the tariffs actually were the primary revenue, but the money coming in from the states was also a big revenue. Those two biggest revenues for the federal government was tariffs, duties, basically, and this tax that was paid by the states based on population, which shows up in Article 1, Section 3, and Article 1, Section 9 at the beginning. But anyway.
Well, that's really, the quota part's really interesting. It takes us back to that 3/5 compromise. And there's two ways to balance this. If slaves are counted as 3/5 of a person, population matters for two things: representation in Congress, but also how much you get taxed. So you had to balance it out. So the South obviously had more slaves, and they would get more, if they counted them as a whole person, they'd get more representation in Congress, which is good, but they'd also have to pay more in taxes, which is bad. So that's the balancing act between the two. Mm-hmm. And it's actually a pretty good compromise if you skip over all the other things surrounding it. But from a pure power sharing standpoint, it made a lot of sense. It's that whole thing of balancing the big state versus small. Same concept there. So I think that's really important. And that made it through the convention, that idea. All right, we've got the manner and conditions of admitting new states. So expansion was already planned. Power of dividing and annexing power of dividing, annexing, and consolidating states on the consent and petition of such states. Now that's interesting because there were border disputes, but we hadn't seen any annexing or divisions of states or consolidation of combining two states. That had never happened. I mean,
yeah, and he's given all of the power to the Congress in this case. And what wound up being decided upon was that if that was to happen, while Congress has a say, so does the legislatures of the states that are affected. And it has to be approved by all parties.
Yeah, and we've actually really only had one that happened once when Maine broke off from Massachusetts. West Virginia doesn't count because Virginia was no longer part of the Union,
right?
Which is actually one of the best arguments for why Lincoln's War was unconstitutional. That it was actually a war. It was not a civil war. It was an invasion.
Yeah, it wasn't a war over slavery as much as it was other things. If it was, as I like to tell people all the time, if it was a war over slavery and its initial reason was slavery, how is it, A, that Washington, D.C. didn't completely get rid of Washington, D.C. until a year after the war started? And B, how is it that West Virginia was admitted as a state to the Union as a slave state?
Yes. It's the, I like it. Well, I'm actually hitting on the fact that after the war, basically Lincoln, we were trying to, try some of the Southerners for treason. Saying secession was illegal, but it clearly was legal because you were able to annex West Virginia from Virginia because it wasn't part of the Union. So it's clear that they knew that secession was legal. Plus the fact that,
or at least that it had happened.
Yeah. Plus the fact that Congress 3 times in 1861 prior to the war tried to pass bills making secession illegal, which means they knew it was legal at the time. So that argument just that secession was illegal, it doesn't work. This was a voluntary union. Otherwise, it never would have been ratified. If they were told that this was the Hotel California where you can check in but you can never leave, nobody ratifies the Constitution.
Now, you will have people argue that because of Texas v. White, secession is illegal. But let me ask you a question. Can judges make law? No. So then they can't make it illegal. Well, if it was illegal already, why would they need Texas v. White to say it was illegal?
Very good. It's an important argument. Really important topic. All right. 23. The assent of the legislature of states shall be sufficient to invest future additional powers in the United States in Congress assembled and shall bind the whole Confederacy. Basically saying the state legislatures can amend the Articles of Confederation. 24 is an important one. The Articles of Confederation shall be inviolably observed, and the Union shall be perpetual unless altered as before directed. That says a lot right there. First of all, their intent was not to repeal the Articles of Confederation and replace it. It was to amend them. They said unless altered. They also said the Union shall be perpetual. And we need to touch on that because that some people take that to interpret it means it's a once you're in the Union you can't leave.
Right.
They
want it to be perpetual. They hope it'll be perpetual, but that does not mean that you're unable to leave. Obviously, you want it to be perpetual. You hope that it will be perpetual.
Yeah,
you don't form a union expecting or hoping that someone leaves. You want it to be perpetual. Just because that word is used, though, doesn't mean, oh, well, then it's illegal to leave. That's just a title.
Yeah, and I make the argument, you've heard me make the argument that we should have an Article 5 convention or a constitutional convention every 10 years mandatory. and basically you'd be renewing the Constitution every 10 years and making the few tweaks that need to be made based on how much federal overreach we saw in the previous decade. I absolutely think that should be a constitutional amendment requiring an Article 5 Constitution every 10 years. And this should be held by the states, not the federal government itself.
You just lost every Eagle Forum and JBS viewer, by the way.
Good riddance. It's funny. But no, it's the only solution we have to pushing back on the encroachment of federal government on state rights. And the federal Congress certainly isn't going to curtail its own power. It never has. We've got 250 years of evidence that it never will. You know, once in a generation, we get an effort like Doge, but that still isn't, doing it legally. That's just trying to make them do what they've already, even with Doge cutbacks, the government's still doing 90% of what they do is constitutionally not allowed. So there's got to be a vehicle to claw back federal power, and it's there. It's Article 5, and unfortunately, we've never once used it. It's one of the 7 articles of the Constitution that these gentlemen met in Philadelphia, and it was so important for the states to be able to have that power to amend the Constitution when necessary. As difficult as the amendment process is, it was so powerful they put it in the Constitution and everyone signed off on it. That part of an Article 5 convention was not even debated in the ratifying conventions.
Right.
It wasn't debated. Everyone thought, yeah, that's a good idea. And yet somehow we've never had a convention. Makes you wonder, right?
Mm-hmm. It makes you wonder. And once again, if the states didn't have any say on amendment other than the ratification part, but that they couldn't propose, that only Congress, the federal government, could propose, I believe that also would have been one of the things that would have kept them from some of those states from ratifying it.
Very good. The said states of NH, I wish I knew what that meant.
I'm still looking it up. I'm still doing some research here as we talk on that, because it's driving me nuts. Because it obviously means the entire union.
Yeah, but I can't.
Context.
I can't. In my imagination, I can't figure out what that is an abbreviation for. He said, etc., guarantee mutually each other and their rights against all other powers and against all rebellion, etc. Rebellion being capitalized is interesting right after Shays' Rebellion. So that's the document that is submitted by Mr. Pinckney. And after that, we are adjourned for the day. So when we meet next, that was on May 29th. We will go to May 30th. And we're going to have some interesting discussion. And I think we will stop there for today.
All right, very good. And the what I'm looking up on NH, that based on I'm actually asking AI to do the deep dive on this. And what I said after I had asked what it stood for, and it suggested just like a basic search on search engines that it stood for New Hampshire, and that makes no sense. So I told it the context of use of NH in Pinckney's document does not support it. Means New Hampshire. Context suggests it refers to the entire union, and since Pinckney was a nationalist, I believe the N stands for national. And the AI blows a little smoke up my rear for a second. That's a sharp observation. But then again, it's not sure really what the NH stands for. Although the word national, the N meaning national, due to Pinckney's nationalist leanings at the time, does make sense to the system, but it still can't figure it out. So I'll play with it. But and here's the thing, and this is the reason I wanted to bring this up here at the end of the program. History and the Constitution, and a lot of it is detective work. You got to remember that during the War of 1812, the Library of Congress was set aflame. We lost a lot of the original documents. So what clues we have on what was meant, what was said, how it was done is based on things like Madison's notes, letters between the founders, things like that didn't get destroyed in the process. But because the details were in the documents that are gone, for the most part, it becomes detective work. And we really have to think about the context of the times and kind of put the pieces together. And so that's why shows like this are so important. And I encourage you to keep returning to these programs, because we're not just going to go through the document and say, well, we think it means this. We are, and I have all my life gone deep into the clues and studied those clues and spent time finding supporting documents. And that's the reason why the Avalon Project is so wonderful, because you can go back to original documents that are available. But just be aware that we can't just decipher or or interpret or define something that's in our Constitution or other things of that time just willy-nilly. And like I said, I did a deep dive here with AI while we were going on with this on just that abbreviation NH. And I'm still trying to figure it out. And I bet you in some of those original documents, it probably reveals itself. We have to maybe look at some of his letters. But once again, that's why it's important to come to the show, because we do the deep dive so that you don't have to.
Yeah, and again, the context he used NH for, the very first mention of it was in the opening line.
Well, at the beginning and the end, it means the entire Union. I just don't know what the N and the H stands for.
It says a confederation between the free and independent states of N.H. So
definitely not New Hampshire.
No, it is not New Hampshire. All right, Doug, I'd like to try to see if we can start getting maybe two of these out a week going forward, because it's going to be a long exercise, and I don't want this to take a year. I'll talk to you off camera, but see if we can schedule our next one. But everyone, thank you for watching. Doug, where can they find you again?
DouglasVGibbs.com, DouglasVGibbs.com. And by the way, my radio show on Saturday nights in San Diego, Mr. Constitution Hour by Douglas V. Gibbs. One website has ranked it as number 9 on the internet for constitutional podcasts. I'm even 4 slots above the JBS podcast, who was number 13 on that list. So,
maybe we can get the Re-Federalist report on there one of these days.
Maybe
we start going live one of these days. All right, everybody, thanks for watching. We will see you again soon. Stay tuned, and I'll have the next video up. Hopefully, we'll do it Monday, Tuesday next week. Although I just got a text, I think I'm doing a radio show on Tuesday, so that may be difficult to do that on Tuesday, but we'll talk later. All right, everybody, till the next time, cheers.